Hi, welcome back to the second part of the Black History Museum, 400 Years of African American. Our facilitator is Renika Montgomery. Again, be aware that the pictures and videos shown on this museum is very graphic, and we are going to ask viewers discretion. And now, Renika.
Hi, I'm Renika Montgomery-Tamakloe. Welcome back, and we're going to start with Abolition to Civil Rights. So remember how we talked about how African Americans have always agitated for their freedom? And pre-Civil War, it was more of an appeal to humanity. So we have Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass was an African American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman. And after escaping from slavery in Maryland, he became a national leader of the abolitionist movement in Massachusetts and New York, becoming famous for his oratory and incisive anti-slavery writings. We have Sojourner Truth, who was born Isabella Baumfree, and she was an African-American abolitionist, author, and women's rights activist. She was born into slavery, and she fled to freedom at age 29. After New York State passed its anti-slavery law in 1827, Truth successfully sued her former master for illegally selling her son. She was the first Black woman to sue a white man in court and win in the United States. She is best known for her speech, "Aren't I a Woman?" And finally, we're going to talk about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was an African-American abolitionist and political activist. She was born into slavery, and she escaped and subsequently made some 13 missions to rescue approximately 70 enslaved people, including family and friends, using the network of anti-slavery activists and safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. She was also a Union spy during the Civil War. We're going to learn more about Harriet Tubman in this video.
Escaped slave, conductor on the Underground Railroad, nurse, scout, and spy during the Civil War, Harriet Tubman was a superwoman.
Here's this tiny 5-foot-tall woman, illiterate, very few resources, an ordinary person who ended up doing extraordinary things. So that's a testament to Harriet Tubman's determination.
The prospect of being sold off and seeing family members ripped away contributed to Tubman's steely resolve to escape from her life in bondage. And when her husband, a free man, refused to join her, she set out alone. Harriet walked from Maryland all the way to Pennsylvania, almost 90 miles from slavery to freedom. Incredibly, she decided to return on foot to the South more than a dozen times to lead other enslaved people to freedom. Her courageous journeys earned her the title, the Moses of her people.
Very, very few freedom seekers returned to their former homes to bring people away. She rescued about 70 family and friends and gave instructions to about another 70 more who found their way to freedom by themselves using her connections along the route.
Tubman worked as a nurse for the Union Army during the Civil War. And because of her vast knowledge of Southern geography and her extensive contacts on the Underground Railroad, she doubled as a spy behind rebel lines. In June of 1863, Tubman helped lead a raid of Black troops along the Combahee River, successfully liberating more than 700 slaves. Tubman became the first woman to lead a major military operation in the history of the United States. Harriet Tubman was buried with military honors in Auburn, New York. In 2016, the Obama administration announced a redesign of the $20 bill, proposing Harriet Tubman as its new face. Despite being delayed, if approved, Harriet Tubman could become the first African American to be featured on United States currency.
And they led to people who were fighting for freedom. So the civil rights movement was led by many, many different people. We have Ella Josephine Baker. She was an African-American civil rights and human rights activist, and she was a largely behind-the-scenes organizer whose career spanned more than 5 decades. In New York City and in the South, she worked alongside some of the most noted civil rights leaders of the 20th century, including WEB Du Bois. We're going to talk more about Ella Baker later. We have Fannie Lou Hamer, who was an American voting and women's rights activist, community organizer, and a leader in the civil rights movement. She was a co-founder and vice chair of the Freedom Democratic Party, which she represented at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. We have Asa Philip Randolph, who was an American unionist, civil rights activist, and politician. Like he in 1925, he's the one who organized and led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first predominantly African-American labor union. He also helped organize various civil rights marches in the 1940s and beyond. Thurgood Marshall was an American lawyer and civil rights activist. He successfully argued the Brown versus the Board of Education case in front of the Supreme Court. He served as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States from October 1967 until October 1991, and Marshall was the court's first African-American justice. And finally, we have Bayard Rustin. He was an American leader in social movements for civil rights, socialism, nonviolence, and gay rights. Rustin worked with A. Philip Randolph on the March to Washington movement in 1941 to press for an end to racial discrimination in employment. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. The Harlem Renaissance was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as like a Black cultural mecca. Remember, we talked about the Great Migration as African Americans travel from the South to the North. Many of them settle in places like Chicago or Harlem. There was a subsequent social and artistic explosion that resulted in this movement, and it lasted from roughly the 19-teens to the 1930s. This period is considered like a golden age in African American culture, manifesting itself in literature, music, stage performance, and art. So we're going to watch a brief video on the Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance is one of the most iconic cultural periods in African American history. Throughout the decade of the 1920s, Black writing, art, and music flourished, ushering in a cultural revolution that rocked the United States.
One of the most important factors that accounted for the rise of what we know of as the Harlem Renaissance is the migration of Black peoples from the South to urban centers like Harlem.
The Jim Crow era began after Reconstruction, and every Southern African American had to think about, what should we do? Should we go or should we stay? For many of these people, it was a matter of life and death, literally.
Sometimes in the most repressive times, we create the most extraordinary art.
Amidst the fervor of the Great Migration, bold, exciting forms of Black music evolved, along with venues to listen and dance to this music. Blues and jazz clubs became a central part of life in Harlem, where artists such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Bessie and Mamie Smith rose to prominence.
He began to cry. He went away and never even said goodbye.
The era also saw the burgeoning of literary work by and about African Americans, which the writer Alain Locke compiled into an anthology. He called it The New Negro, and its name came to define a movement.
The Harlem Renaissance is a facet of a larger movement that we think of as the New Negro movement, where you have a new generation of Black people, by this point, 2 generations out of slavery, using the arts as a way to help people gain broader civil and political rights.
Some of the framers of what became the Renaissance make the argument that the artistic worth of a people has to be proven by the worth of the art and literature they produced, especially for people that historically, over centuries, have been defined as without culture, without history, and without any record of achievement.
The Harlem Renaissance was the flowering of creativity that had been suppressed for centuries. People that had the sense that things were opening up, and finally, we can be the people that we imagine ourselves to be.
Let's talk about about the Crisis. So the Crisis is the official magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. It was founded in 1910 by WEB Du Bois as its editor, Oswald Garrison Villard, J. Max Barber, Charles Edward Russell, Kelly Miller, William Stanley Brathwaite, and Mary Dunlop McLean. The Crisis has been in continuous print since 1910, and it is the oldest Black-oriented magazine in the world. Today, The Crisis is a quarterly journal of civil rights, history, politics, and culture, and seeks to educate and challenge its readers about issues that continue to plague African Americans and other communities of color. Who is W.E.B. Du Bois? So, we're going to talk about it. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was an American sociologist, socialist, historian, civil rights activist, Pan-Africanist, author, writer, and editor. Born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, Du Bois grew up in a relatively tolerant and integrated community. And after completing graduate work at the University of Berlin and Harvard, where he was the first African-American to earn a doctorate, he became a professor of history, sociology, and economics at Atlanta University. Du Bois was one of the founders of the NAACP in 1909. Now we're going to talk about one of my favorite parts of this presentation, the Savoy. So what was the Savoy? The Savoy Ballroom was a large ballroom for music and public dancing located at 596 Lenox Avenue between 140th and 141st Streets in the Harlem neighborhood of Manhattan, New York City. Lenox Avenue was the main thoroughfare through Upper Harlem. Poet Langston Hughes calls it the heartbeat of Harlem in Jukebox Love Song, and he set his work, Lenox Avenue Midnight, on the legendary street. The Savoy was one of many Harlem hotspots along Lenox, but it was the one to be called the world's finest ballroom. It was in operation from March 12, 1926 to July 10, 1958. And as Barbara Engelbrecht writes in her article, Swinging at the Savoy, it was a building, a geographic place, a ballroom, and the soul of a neighborhood. It was opened and owned by a white entrepreneur, Jay Fagan, and Jewish businessman, Mo Gale. It was managed by African-American businessman and civic leader, Charles Buchanan. Buchanan, who was born in the British West Indies, sought to run a luxury ballroom to accommodate the many thousands who wished to dance in an atmosphere of tasteful refinement, rather than in the small, stuffy halls and the foul-smelling, smoke-laden cellar nightclubs. Now we're going to watch a video about the Savoy.
I'm glad you asked. Here are 4 facts you need to know about the Savoy Ballroom. Number 1. The Savoy Ballroom was the first integrated ballroom for dancers. On March 12, 1926, in Harlem, New York, the Savoy Ballroom was created. During the height of segregated times, the Savoy was built for Black patrons. There was no separate entrance for whites. There were no balconies where the white customers would watch the Blacks perform. The opening of the Savoy marked a change in the American social pattern. For the first time in history, Black and white dancers danced on the same floor, sat and ate across from one another in the booths. This set an enormous precedent, influencing later civil rights movements in the 1960s. Number 2. The Savoy Ballroom was the first integrated ballroom for musicians. In the 1920s, jazz needed a place to develop where innovation was not only accepted, but was encouraged. That place was the Savoy. It was where white and Black musicians mixed. With the exception of Cab Calloway and later Duke Ellington, it wasn't until late in the swing era in the late 1930s that Black bands could play for the white clientele in hotels and other ballrooms. But since audiences wanted to hear Cab Calloway, not the band behind him, the soloists were not spotlighted. Most of the innovative work came from Black bands like those led by Jimmy Lunsford and Lucky Millinder, who were restricted to playing in the poor-paying clubs in Black areas, but everyone was comfortable at the Savoy. Music at the time was segregated only by habit. Black musicians played with Black bands. White musicians played society swing. Music promoters like John Hammond knew that the music had to progress. If Black and white musicians couldn't come together, swing would be short-lived, and he fought very hard for more integration. Hammond saw the future of good music depended upon free racial integration. He knew change was needed if this music was to survive. He was the first to bring musicians like Fletcher Henderson, Lionel Hampton, Teddy Wilson, and Charlie Christian to the listening public, and the first to recognize the talents of, among others, Billie Holiday, Lester Young, and Aretha Franklin. Benny Goodman, for instance, played the Savoy only once, during his famous Battle of the Bands with Chick Webb in 1938. However, he visited often when he was in New York and was invited to sit in with the band on numerous occasions, as were the Dorseys and numerous sidemen in white bands. The Savoy played an enormous and largely unrecognized role in the history of jazz. The Savoy should always be remembered along with the men and women who created the music that all America danced to. Number 3. Famous singers blossomed at the Savoy. In 1934, for instance, Chick Webb plucked the young Ella Fitzgerald out of an Apollo engagement and groomed her for his band. Lena Horne earned much of her early acclaim at the Savoy, as did Billie Holiday, Diana Washington, and Sarah Vaughan. All of these singers would go and have massive careers, but most of them started at the Savoy Ballroom. White artists such as Frank Sinatra and the Andrews Sisters also sang there. Number 4. Lindy Hop was created and evolved at the Savoy Ballroom. Stretching an entire city block from 140th Street to 141st Street on Lenox Avenue, the Savoy Ballroom had two very distinct sides. The 141st Street side was called The Corner, and it belonged to the professional Lindy dancers. It was, in a way, sacred. This was the area where Whitey's Lindy Hoppers worked out their intricate routines and had spectators watch them come and dance. Because of the popularity of Lindy Hop, press agents saw the value of having stars come to the ballroom. The boxes were reserved for them, and stars such as Alice Faye, Lana Turner, Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, and Dolores Del Rio, the latter on the arm of Orson Welles, all came to the Savoy. At the time, everyone came to watch the Lindy Hoppers dance. The Lindy Hop dance would further impact dance culture throughout Harlem and spread quickly across the United States and to Europe. So there you have it, 4 fun facts about the Savoy Ballroom. Listen, if you want to get more rich content like this, subscribe to the channel.
We're going to talk a little bit about Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was a jazz composer and trumpet player during the Harlem Renaissance, and he's widely recognized as a founding father of jazz. He appeared in 30 films and averaged 300 concerts per year, and he'd play for anyone. He performed for both kids on the street and heads of state.
So we're going to play a few seconds of the song so you can recognize and identify Louis Armstrong. And actually, we're going to tell you a fact about this song at the end.
I see trees of green. I see them blue for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, bright blessed days, dark sacred nights, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
So like Renika said, there's a lot of like evolution in this music, but they're also expressed how they felt and also civil rights movement. And this song actually is talking about the equal treatment and how perfect that world will be.
All right.
There we go.
Now we're going to talk briefly about Hollywood. So, African American characters have played a part in Hollywood almost since from the beginning. Most of them, however, were not played by African American actors. They were often white actors in blackface. And the roles that African Americans played were very often limited to things such as servants or degenerates. Also, Hollywood played a very big part in the resurgence of the KKK. In 1915, we have D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. It was a Hollywood spectacle at like 3 hours long, and it was really just a 3-hour long racist screed that really galvanized a movement in the US. So now we're going to watch a video on the birth of the nation and the NAACP.
Most early films consisted of one reel, lasted around 15 minutes, and cost a few $100s to produce. All of that changed in 1915, when a film called The Birth of a Nation, a 3-hour-long saga, was released by director D.W. Griffith. It instantly stood out as a technological and storytelling marvel. It also stood out as a monumental piece of blatantly racist propaganda.
The Birth of a Nation fixes a certain story of the Civil War and Reconstruction in the minds of the American public. And that story is that Black people were too lazy and ignorant to fully master the citizenship that they were offered by Reconstruction.
Birth of a Nation really didn't have Black people in it. So these white people in blackface portraying congressmen who are obviously not ready for self-government, portraying the idea of the rapist. And these are all the stereotypes that are believed by many, many Americans.
The film was met with fierce resistance from African Americans, particularly from a recently founded organization focused on the advancement of the race, the NAACP.
One of the most important early initiatives of the NAACP was organizing against the Birth of a Nation. They generated a lot of interest by protesting the film and drew in a great deal of support from African Americans.
Despite its best efforts, the NAACP couldn't persuade censorship boards or theaters to limit the film's reach. But the young organization gained national prominence because of this campaign. That year, membership almost doubled, and that number would continue to grow as it mounted the fight against Jim Crow.
Those activists dissented at the time, and those dissenting voices were always there. They were there during the darkest periods of American history. And remembering that tradition, to me, is almost more important than remembering the failures and the losses and the terrorism that Black people faced.
All right. Now let's talk the Civil Rights era. So the Civil Rights era is the period of time from about 1955 to 1968 in which African Americans fight to become full citizens in the United States. So first we're going to watch a video on the Civil Rights movement.
Nearly a century after the end of the Civil War and the dawn of Reconstruction, African Americans still found themselves fighting for their basic rights as citizens. The modern civil rights movement in the mid-20th century finally secured them.
Most historians actually date the start of the formal civil rights movement to Brown versus Board of Education. Brown really stokes the fervor of the nation. Then, in December of 1955, Rosa Parks decided as an act of resistance that she would not give up her seat to a white man on the bus.
Rosa Parks' deliberate act of resistance led to a bus boycott that thrust into the limelight a young preacher with a PhD. He would become one of the movement's most charismatic leaders. His name was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
One of the most iconic moments is the March on Washington in 1963, led by Martin Luther King Jr.
200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come united in one cause.
One day right now in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
This becomes visualized on the news and begins to change the way that Americans are starting to think about the civil rights movement.
As the civil rights movement attained greater visibility, it was often met with increased brutality and violence. Yet in the midst of so much sacrifice and heartbreak, the work of civil rights activists began to bear fruit.
In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of '64, and that's designed to desegregate businesses and government employment. And then in 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of '65.
The passage of the Voting Rights Act was a monumental victory for African Americans. Tragically, just 3 years after it was passed, Dr. King would be assassinated. Many feel looking back that the movement died that day. But in fact, the movement took on new forms and continued. And it must continue today as important victories such as the Voting Rights Act are under attack.
Until we deal with the fact that the backlash is often made possible not just by the other side growing in power, but by those who claim to care about equality losing their own resolve, there will be moments of this cycle happening over and over again.
Right, we're going to talk more about Ella Baker. So remember, she was an African-American civil rights and human rights activist who worked largely behind the scene. So we're going to watch this video about her called The Mother of the Civil Rights Movement.
What do two of the most important civil rights organizations have in common? Meet Ella Baker, the brilliant black woman whose ideas and careful grassroots organizing helped give birth to Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference and to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. For this reason, Ella Baker is reverentially known as the mother of the civil rights movement. Born in Virginia in 1903, Ella Baker was educated at Shaw University before moving to New York City in 1927. By 1930, she'd started organizing.
Ella Baker joined the NAACP in 1940 and helped young leaders find their voice and their leadership capacity. And one of those people was Rosa Parks, someone we all know. Ella Baker was also recruited by Martin Luther King to help run the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was helping to build the civil rights movement.
Then in 1960, a group of black college students were denied service at Woolworth's segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. In an act of nonviolent protest, the students refused to leave, inspiring similar sit-ins across the South.
Ella Baker left SCLC to help a group of young people form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
I remember Miss Baker saying, many of you are from some of the quote-unquote best schools in the country, so when you go into rural areas, don't go in there thinking you're going to lead the people. Find out what the people want.
When you heard Ella Baker speak, you were ready to get out there. She really wanted us to stand up and speak out, and she gave you the energy to push. You can lead, you can be somebody, you can do something.
More interested in effecting change than public acclaim or financial reward, Baker inspired a generation of young Americans to risk their lives to fight racism, sexism, and white supremacy. Simply put, the mother of the civil rights movement had many children, and we are her heirs.
Now we're going to briefly talk about Martin Luther King Jr. So as you know, Martin Luther King Jr. was an American Baptist minister and activist who became the most visible spokesperson and leader in the civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. King is best known for advancing civil rights through nonviolence and civil disobedience, inspired by his Christian beliefs and the nonviolent activism of Mahatma Gandhi. He was the son of early civil rights activist Martin Luther King Sr. King participated in and led marches for Blacks' rights to vote, for desegregation, for labor rights, and other basic civil rights. King led the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott and later became the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he led the unsuccessful Albany movement in Albany, Georgia, and helped organize some of the nonviolent 1963 protests in Birmingham, Alabama. King helped organize the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Now we're going to listen to a brief video about Martin Luther King.
I have a dream.
On August 28, 1963, a young Baptist minister from Atlanta, Georgia, delivered one of the most powerful speeches in American history. Martin Luther King Jr. worked on a draft with his closest advisors in a hotel lobby the night before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. But his decision to improvise on his prepared text turned that draft into something else. The next day, about halfway into his speech, he expressed,
"We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream."
There's a famous story that his favorite singer, the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, says to him while he's giving the speech and he sort of feels that he might be losing the audience. She says, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream."
While Dr. King never confirmed that he heard Mahalia's prompting, at that very moment, he began to improvise.
And he goes deep in his pocket and pulls out the "I Have a Dream," which was a refrain that he had used before.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Dr. King went on to paint an inclusive vision of a united, colorblind America. For many Americans, this speech was their first exposure to the oratorical power of the Black Baptist tradition.
Spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
About 250,000 people made up Dr. King's audience that day on the Mall, but the influence of that speech would continue to resonate far beyond that audience down to the present day. A lasting testament to what Dr. King and his fellow leaders were able to convey on that hot summer day.
Now we're going to talk about Selma and the right to vote, and John Lewis. So John Robert Lewis was an American politician, statesman, and civil rights activist and leader who served in the United States House of Representatives for Georgia's 5th Congressional District from 1987 until his death in 2020. He was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, from 1963 to 1966. Lewis was one of the Big Six leaders of groups who organized the 1963 March on Washington. He fulfilled many key roles in the civil rights movement and its actions to end legalized racial segregation in the United States. Most importantly, in 1965, Lewis led the first of 3 Selma to Montgomery marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. In an incident which became known as Bloody Sunday, state troopers and police attacked the marchers, including Lewis. So now we're going to watch a video on John Lewis and the right to vote.
Congressman John Lewis is a living legend and an icon of the civil rights movement. A central focus of Lewis's activism has been the fight for the right to vote, a right that until 1965, generations of African Americans had been denied.
When John Lewis was a teenager, he read in a comic book about what Dr. King had been doing in Montgomery. And he went to his parents and he says, I want to be part of this.
By 1963, John Lewis had helped organize demonstrations and sit-ins across the South. When he was elected chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that same year, he became one of the Big Six leaders of the Civil Rights Movement and helped plan the March on Washington. At age 23, Lewis was the youngest person to speak at the event. But his most defining moment came 2 years later, when he turned his attention to voting rights and helped lead a dangerous civil rights march from Selma to Montgomery.
John Lewis was on the front lines of the 50-mile march, starting in Selma to Montgomery, demonstrating the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young African-American who was killed by a state trooper, but also the denial of African-Americans' right to vote across the South. If they could get the nation to zero in on Selma, Alabama, a place that had a large black population and very few African-Americans who were registered to vote, then perhaps there could be some action.
As activists marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers tear-gassed and beat them on what came to be known as Bloody Sunday. Lewis himself was severely beaten, suffering a fractured skull. 8 days after Bloody Sunday, President Lyndon Baines Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Act in Congress, and he would sign it into law in August 1965.
Today, we strike away the last major shackle of those fierce and ancient bonds.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was written on the road from Selma to Montgomery. The government responded and reacted to the power of the people.
John Lewis has helped secure the right to vote for millions of Americans. He's been on the front lines of the fight for civil rights for over 50 years. And the last time I checked, he was still fighting.
Too many people struggled, suffered, and died to make it possible for every American to exercise their right to vote. And we have come too far together to ever turn back. We must stand up, speak up, and speak out.
So, check the dates. 1965 is when the Voting Rights Act is signed, 95 years after the 15th Amendment. And why else is John Lewis important? There's currently an act with his name on it sitting in Congress that they can't pass to ensure voting rights for all in the United States. Voting rights is still an issue that is important. Now, we're going to take a different tactic. We're going to talk about a little bit about the Black Power Revolution and how it sprung up out of the Civil Rights era. So in 1965, like we said, one of the last traceable remnants of Jim Crow ideology was thought to be taken off the books with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. However, despite the implementation of the legislation, racial tension remained. Less than a week into the new law, riots broke out in the predominantly Black neighborhood of Watts after an altercation between a Black man and the police. So now we're going to watch a video on Black Power.
In 1965, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, bringing down one of the last legal vestiges of Jim Crow segregation. Just 5 days later, an altercation between an unarmed Black man and the police sparked riots on the streets of Watts, a predominantly Black neighborhood in Los Angeles. The riots revealed that America still faced deep racial issues, and in the coming years, urban unrest roiled cities across the nation.
Dr. King's message of nonviolence wore thin as the 1960s progressed, particularly because violence is everywhere.
As race relations deteriorated, Stokely Carmichael, a young, charismatic, electrifying speaker, was searching for a new way to reframe the civil rights struggle. And he found it through one resonant metaphor.
It's time we stand up and take over. Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. We want black power. We want black power. We want black power.
The civil rights movement had been extraordinarily successful, but there has not necessarily been the tangible transformation in black people's living conditions. Carmichael is making an argument that only black power will take black people to that next level.
Hey, what do you want? That's what we gonna get.
The effect was electrifying. Soon after, black power groups were organizing across the country, each with their own idea about what the phrase actually meant.
You had everybody from those that are saying, yes, let's go for elected office, to those that say, let's overthrow the government.
It called for self-determination. It called for an end to nonviolence as the only strategy of the Black movement.
Looking back, Black Power marked a startling shift in the civil rights movement and in the evolution of Black consciousness.
Black power is really going to inspire a whole new wave of Black elected officials and inspire the Black arts movement, using culture to transform what we think of as Black identity, proud, strong Black women and men.
Black, the word that for decades so many African Americans most dreaded being called, almost overnight became both a battle cry and a badge of honor.
So, why was Black power important? Because as they said, there's tangible proof, there's laws that are being created, but there isn't any tangible movement in everyday lives of African Americans. So they wanted to create a situation where they could enjoy the full aspects of citizenship in the US. Now we're going to talk about Malcolm X. So Malcolm X is known as like the kind of polar opposite of MLK in that he did not preach nonviolence. He was by any means necessary, and he was very closely tied into the Black power ideology. So one of his most famous quotes is, "A man who stands for nothing will fall for anything." So now we're going to watch a video on Malcolm X and the Black power ideology.
Malcolm X's strident critique of the nonviolent philosophy of the civil rights movement sowed the seeds for the flowering of Black nationalism in the second half of the 1960s. Malcolm spent his youth in northern and midwestern cities, but he was profoundly transformed in prison when he joined the Nation of Islam, a religious movement led by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It combined Black nationalism with the Islamic faith and embraced the concept of Black self-defense.
Malcolm X realized that while Martin Luther King was preaching nonviolence and peace, you had to send a message. He was a warrior, he was a general, and they feared him.
Malcolm encouraged his followers to achieve empowerment
by any means necessary. We intend to fire our people up so much until if they can't have their equal share in the house, they'll burn it down.
Dr. King felt that Malcolm's talk of violence was counterproductive and ultimately would, quote, reap nothing but grief.
The Negroes themselves should take whatever steps necessary to defend themselves.
Malcolm X's influence was profound in terms of the way African Americans looked at themselves and the way that the nation began to look at them. It called for Black dignity, Black self-respect.
Malcolm was adamant that words associated with slavery, such as Negro and colored, should be discarded for Black and Afro-American. His theories and his philosophy formed the foundation of the ideology of Black power.
Malcolm X is the key common denominator for all Black power activists. They use his speeches, they use his political thought, both in the Nation of Islam and outside of the Nation of Islam, as a sort of blueprint or framework for their own political activism.
The tensions that had been building between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm reached a breaking point after Malcolm made a controversial comment following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, leading to a bitter split. Facing a spiritual crisis, Malcolm turned inward, dedicating much of his time to learning more about his faith, including undertaking the Muslims' sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. Tragically, members of the Nation of Islam would assassinate Malcolm before his new philosophy could gain momentum. But his autobiography would become a key text of the Black Revolution, and it remains a key part of the American literary canon today. From Chuck D of Public Enemy to President Barack Obama, Malcolm X's bold and resonant voice has inspired generations to fight the power. Through his writings and speeches, Malcolm's message to Black people to take control of their own destiny lives on.
Now we're going to talk about the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are another group that are an offshoot of Black Power. So who are the Black Panthers? They were the Black Panthers for Self-Defense. This group, and they were formed to protect Black citizens from police brutality. So they noticed that there was a lot of police brutality in their neighborhoods. So they armed themselves because it was allowed at the time to open carry, and they would monitor any police interaction in their neighborhoods in an activity called cop watching. But they did way more than that, even though that's what they're most famous for. They inspired the USDA school breakfast and lunch program as they fed school children breakfast and lunch for free. They had free clothing programs for the needy. They had food banks. They had free health care. They did free sickle cell testing, which sickle cell is a disease that predominantly affects African Americans in this country. They had literacy programs. They gave away books. They basically expanded from self-defense into a social services program. Now we're going to watch more in this video on who were the Black Panthers.
In October 1966, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, a pair of students in Oakland, galvanized by Malcolm X's philosophy of Black self-determination, launched the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Their goal was to protect their community from racism and violence, which meant protecting it from the police.
When we first started, we had a police alert patrol, and we would patrol the community. If we saw the police brutalizing anyone, we would put an end to this. Usually the police wouldn't brutalize anyone if we were on hand.
Did the Panthers embrace a willingness to use arms to defend themselves? Absolutely. Unfortunately, that's usually the only part of the story that we get. Even more energy was expended in social programs.
The Panthers put their revolutionary philosophy into practical action. They developed programs targeted at poor Black people. They provided the community with free medical care, including sickle cell screening programs, as well as clothing for the needy. Many believe that the Panthers' free breakfast program for school children helped inspire the USDA's federal breakfast program.
We were not for integration, we were for self-determination. We wanted to have the right to determine ourselves what we wanted. Economic opportunity, decent education, access to the full complement of privileges, benefits, and responsibilities of any American.
Not even the FBI was able to stop the spread of the Panthers' ideals, encouraging Black people to defend themselves from police brutality and fight for their rights. Decades later, the Black Panthers' legacy continues to live in a variety of political, cultural, and social realms, most recently in the Black Lives Matter movement.
All right. Now we talked about school segregation. Let's talk about school integration. Remember, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 was a landmark decision that the Supreme Court stated that separate but equal is inherently unequal. But the Supreme Court left it up to states to determine how to integrate schools. So we are now going to watch a video about school integration in Boston 20 years after Brown in 1974.
In 1954, the United States Supreme Court, in the landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education, held that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Where desegregation was accepted and implemented, the strategy was successful. But in many parts of the country, it would take much more than a court order to change public opinion rooted in centuries of anti-black racism. Politicians in county and state governments across the South found ways to go around the laws. Sometimes they slashed state funding for public schools that integrated. Sometimes they supported private academies attended predominantly by white students.
The main thrust behind African American interest in desegregating was a desire for access to quality education. They understood that dollars followed white children into white schools.
Nearly 20 years after the Brown decision, many schools remained segregated, even in the North. And nowhere was this more evident than in Boston, Massachusetts. In response, the NAACP presented a class action suit demanding that schools and educational officials should act. In 1974, a federal judge in Massachusetts ruled that students in Boston would be bused from one neighborhood to another neighborhood to balance school systems racially.
Working class whites, one of the things that they have been able to benefit from is being able to send their children to all white schools and the resources and the privilege that comes along with that. And now they're being asked to give that up.
In South Boston, as many as 18,000 students were forced to attend new schools. Angry protesters carried signs, hurled bricks at buses, and blocked school entrances. Opposition to integration continued well after the initial violence subsided. Many middle-class white families moved to the suburbs, abandoning the city's public school system. 60 years after Brown v. Board of Education, American classrooms remain shockingly segregated. A direct result of families continuing to move to the suburbs, taking public funding based on property taxes along with them. The goals of Brown v. Board remain unfulfilled, even though its spirit lives on.
The fight for school integration continues today in modern forms with Black schools being chronically underfunded, the voucher issues, all of these things can take their roots back to school integration. Now we're going to talk about convict leasing. So remember how I told how the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery except as punishment for a crime? Well, convict leasing is the way to get around that. So what is convict leasing? It was a system of forced penal labor, which was historically practiced in the southern United States and overwhelmingly targeted African American men. And so recently, a form of the practice, which draws voluntary labor from the general prison population, has been instituted in Western states. Lots of the firefighters that fight wildfires in California are actually prisoners. In the earlier forms of the practice, convict leasing provided prison labor to private parties such as plantation owners and corporations. Sounds suspiciously like slavery, right? For like the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, Chattahoochee Brick Company, the lessee was responsible for feeding, clothing, and housing the prisoners. Now, the Federal Prison Industries Incorporated, doing business as Unicor, since 1977, is a wholly owned United States government corporation created in 1934 as a prison labor program for inmates within the Federal Bureau of Prisons and a component of the Department of Justice. It is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Under U.S. federal law, all physically able inmates who are not a security risk or have a health exception are required to work either for Unicor or at some other prison job. Inmates earn from 23 cents an hour up to a maximum of $1.15 an hour, way, way below the current federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. FPI is a mandatory source for the federal government and will receive priority when the federal government purchases products manufactured by FPI, such as office furniture, for the United States Capitol to replace damages caused by rioters during the storming of the United States Capitol. So prison labor is still a big deal and a big source of funding. And The rise in prison labor was correlated with a rise in what we call like nuisance laws. Things like vagrancy and loitering laws become very popular in the late 1800s and beyond as a way to get people into the prison system so they can be used as free labor. Now we're going to watch a video on convict leasing.
The labor system that took shape in the late 19th century developed coercive means to ensure that cotton remained king. It was called convict leasing. Get arrested on a minor charge or a trumped-up charge, you could find yourself locked up and then hired out to a corporation bidding on inmate labor. The pipeline from prisons to profits in this country has deep roots.
The aftermath of slavery was in some ways worse than slavery itself. Unlike before, when someone who owned you, driving you too hard was counterproductive because you would lose your investment. Convict leasing was different. You could get them cheaper, and if you actually drove them to death, there was more where that came from.
In the 13th Amendment, which ends the institution of slavery, of course, there is a loophole. Convicts who have been convicted of a crime, they actually can be forced to work for free.
In Alabama in 1850, 99% of the people who were incarcerated were white. In Alabama by the 1880s, 85% of the people incarcerated were black. So we could have a debate about how many of those black people were actually innocent, or we could have a conversation about the use of the criminal justice system to target both the innocent and the guilty alike. That continues all the way to the present, where even today, about just under 40% of the nation's prisoners are black, and yet the African-American population's about 13%. They are snatching up bodies everywhere to fuel this system.
The idea in which more money can be made out of their incarceration is still very much part of our criminal justice system.
Convict leasing is still a problem to this day. Now we're going to talk a little bit again about something, a lighter topic, athletics. Post-Civil War and Reconstruction, African Americans began excelling in athletics. So we have Muhammad Ali, who was born Cassius Clay, and he was an African American boxer, social activist, and philanthropist. He is widely considered one of the greatest boxers and athletes of all time. Ali was known for his opposition to the Vietnam War and his support for civil rights. He actually refused to be drafted and lost out on boxing opportunities because of it. He took his case all the way, I think, up to the Supreme Court. Now we're going to watch a video on Muhammad Ali.
It has been said that I have two alternatives, either go to jail or go to the army. But I would like to say that there is another alternative, and that alternative is justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Muhammad Ali has just refused to be inducted into the United States Armed Forces.
He refused induction on the grounds of his religious convictions on war.
My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some poor hungry people in the mud for big powerful America and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger.
You know, Muhammad Ali is really important in this because when Ali refuses induction, there's a famous column in the New York Times written by Tom Wicker where he just wonders out loud what would happen if you had 100,000 Muhammad Alis. You had 100,000 people who were prepared to do what Muhammad Ali just did. You would bring this war to a stop. So the draft resistors set that kind of as a goal.
It took an all-white jury less than a half hour to find Muhammad Ali guilty of all charges and specifications. He was sentenced to the maximum, 5 years in prison, and was fined $10,000.
I find nothing amusing or interesting or tolerable about this man. He's a disgrace to his country, his race, and what he laughingly describes as his profession. He has been found guilty. He is out on bail. He will inevitably go to prison, as well he should. He's a simplistic fool and a pawn.
Do you share the same concern that Muhammad has for his draft status?
Oh, I certainly do. My views on the draft are very clear. I'm against it. And I think the sooner our country does away with the draft, the better it will be for everybody.
So now we're going to watch a video about little known Black heroes in sports.
During Black History Month, it's important to pay tribute to major icons that changed the sports world forever. But there are many Black men and women who paved the way for African Americans in sports today that often go overlooked. Here are some of their stories. Moses Fleetwood Walker. Jackie Robinson is widely recognized for breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball, but it was Moses Fleetwood Walker who was actually the first African American to play in the MLB on May 1st, 1884. Walker was a catcher for the Toledo Blue Stockings, and although he only played one season of professional baseball, his courage to step onto the field every day while fans, opponents, and even teammates hurled racial slurs his way is heroic. While Walker isn't as celebrated as Robinson, his actions during a time where African Americans were still enslaved in parts of the United States should never go unnoticed. Charlie Sifford. In 1961, Charlie Sifford made history when he became the first African American to play on the PGA Tour. Through decades of fighting discrimination, Sifford's success and continued fight for people of color forced the PGA to lift its ban.
Now we are going to talk a little bit about Venus and Serena Williams. So they are among the most decorated female athletes of all time. Serena Williams actually holds the record for the most Grand Slam titles in the modern open era at 23 for men or women. Venus has 7 Grand Slam titles. They have A total of 9 Olympic medals between them, 8 of them gold. They've won 14 doubles Grand Slam titles and have spent a combined 330 weeks ranked as world number 1. But their greatness extends beyond the tennis court. Venus Williams was instrumental in getting equal payment for female tennis players in the Grand Slam tournaments. She actually picked up the mantle left by Billie Jean King and others. And Venus and Serena continued to advocate for the end of gender pay disparities in all aspects of life. So now we're going to watch a short video on their childhood and upbringing before they became tennis greats.
Now we want to introduce you to a proud father, a man who is pushing his daughter, Venus Williams, to be the best in the world.
Good racket speed. Good racket speed, Venus. Speed that racket head up.
Richard Williams, who supposedly bought a book or some DVD or something and sort of said, I'm going to teach these kids how to play tennis in some really tough part of Los Angeles.
We grew up on Stockton Street, Compton, California, 90221. That's where we grew up. And I'm going to tell you something, there was nothing remotely unhood about it.
Don't win. You got to win. No, you're going to win. Aren't you? You going to win for us? Mm-hmm. Good girl. That's all I'm necessary.
How do you feel the way you're hitting the ball right now?
Good, Daddy.
Okay, how about your feet? Your feet moving well?
No, Daddy.
How about yours?
Yes, sir.
Very good. So what we want to do, don't get excited. This is your game.
Richard was going around and begging private country clubs like Riviera Country Club and others to give him their used balls. And he would then fill up a shopping cart in an old Volkswagen bus.
We didn't talk on the phone. We didn't go to school parties and all that stuff. But somehow I don't feel like I missed out. I mean, there's probably a few things I wanted to go to, but I figured I wasn't going to go, so I didn't ask. And anyway, most of the time I was at practice.
She was, I guess, the guinea pig, in a sense.
Venus, absolutely. There was so much pressure on her to become a great player. You know, Richard was talking about it every single day to every newspaper in the country. You know, so she definitely she had it the toughest.
If you're down with your feet flat like a 97-year-old person, you'll never be a tennis player.
Richard was very, very protective, and he generally would never let anyone around the girls. He was extremely protective as he had seen so much. Richard Williams was from Shreveport, Louisiana, and came from a very small town, and he was raised, by a single mother who instilled in him some really great values. But the things that Richard saw transformed his thinking and his outlook really on everything, and justifiably so. He had seen men beaten. He had seen, people denied opportunity. He grew up in an era where, the colored only sign was standard.
A lot of things went wrong here. Right here is where 6 or 7 guys helped me down and actually took a nail that goes in a cross tie and nailed that sucker right into my leg. The reason they would do something like this is simply because I wouldn't call them mister. And I don't think it was fair for me to call no one mister that always called me boy and nigger and always trying to kill me.
Did you think you could beat her?
I know I can beat her.
You know you can beat her. Very confident.
I'm very confident.
You say it so easily. Why?
Because I believe it.
Cut right here, if you don't mind. And let me tell you what. What she said it with so much confidence the first time. But if you keep going on and on.
Listen, we can't keep interrupting. I mean, if you want...
You got to understand that you're dealing with an image of a 14-year-old child. And this child gonna be out there playing when your old ass and me gonna be in the grave. When she says something, we done told you what's happening. You're dealing with a little black kid, and let her be a kid. She done answered it with a lot of confidence. Leave that alone. What do you feel inside when you're on the court?
I feel good. I feel good.
What didn't I do to try to copy Venus when I was younger? I mean, her favorite color was my favorite color. Her favorite animal was my favorite animal. She wanted to win Wimbledon. I wanted to Wimbledon.
She is tennis prodigy Venus Williams, and she's also our Sportswoman of the Week.
It was very difficult being in the shadow of Venus because ever since I can remember, Venus was always in the newspapers and always, in the press.
I wish your feet keep moving like that.
Love to move like that there. That's really good, you know.
I was never supposed to be good. I was never the one that was supposed to be like a great player, but I was determined not to become a statistic. So that's the only reason I played tennis. And, I was a copycat, basically.
Serena, she didn't have that power when she first started, so she had to try to beat you different ways. She would hit angles, she was trying drop shots, and then once she got her power level up, her serve became as dominant as Venus's.
Game, Miss Williams.
All right, and now we've come to the end of our presentation, and we're going to talk about modern activism. So let's start with Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman, the murderer of Trayvon Martin. Black Lives Matter Global Network is a global organization in the US, UK, and Canada whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. By combating and countering acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation, and centering Black joy, we are winning immediate improvement in lives. And Black Lives Matter was started by 3 Black women. So this is like Black Lives Matter's mission statement, and they talk about what they believe in and who they are and what they are working towards. So let's talk a little bit about critical race theory. So what is it? So many people have talked about critical race theory. It's been in the news, but critical race theory is actually a concept that comes out of graduate legal education. And it says that race is a social construct, and racism is not just based on individuals or individual actions, but is embedded in legal systems and in policies. So to sum it up, race isn't a person, race is a system. Racism is a system. So CRT isn't a curriculum. It's a way of looking at the effects of historical and contemporary institutional racism, the laws, policies, and institutions that uphold racial inequality on the lives of minorities in the US. And so it's a way of teaching people to think critically on what they are taught. And if you see classes that focus on critical race theory or use its principles, they're more likely to be upper level college or graduate level classes, not in schools. So now we're going to talk about intersectionality. Intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in about 30 years ago. And it's about the ways in which people can have multiple identities. So as she says, these days I start with what it's not, because there has been distortion. It's not identity politics on steroids. It is not a mechanism to turn white men into the new pariahs. It's basically a lens, a prism, for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. So you can have someone who endures racism, but they're also a woman, and they are poor, and they might be queer, and they might be an immigrant to the country. All of those are ways in which they can be discriminated against. And their total discrimination isn't just like, adding it up. It's talking about the ways that they multiply and combine to oppress people in this country. And now we're going to talk about the new Jim Crow. So remember 13th Amendment and its little loophole about slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime. Well, Michelle Alexander delves into that in her book, The New Jim Crow. So The New Jim Crow is an in-depth guide that provides a launching pad for groups that wish to engage in deep, meaningful dialogue about race, racism, and structural inequality in the age of mass incarceration. So the study guide and call to action spans the entirety of the new Jim Crow, engaging the critical questions of how we managed to create nearly overnight a penal system unprecedented in world history. The US actually imprisons more of its population than any other country in the world, and how that system actually functions as opposed to the way it is advertised. Like, for example, the war on drugs, the sentencing disparities between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. You get 10 times you get 10 times a sentence for the same amount of crack as you would for cocaine. Now we're going to talk about Colin Kaepernick and his protest about taking a knee. So back in 2016, Kaepernick began sitting down during the national anthem, and people condemned him for dishonoring the flag and country, but others encouraged him. He was protesting police brutality against Black Americans. So a week later, he talked to a former NFL player who also was a Green Beret, and he suggested that he kneel instead of sit. And he started to kneel. It became a big issue. He actually lost his space he lost his job in the NFL, but he gained prominence as an agitator for civil rights. And so finally, we're going to talk about local activism in Massachusetts. So we have Search Our Minds, Not Our Bags. In December 2019, Holyoke High School introduced a new search policy that required school administrators to conduct regular searches of student belongings. Holyoke High School is primarily a minority school. The students organized, attended community meetings, and educated people about the new policy. They also did research. They reviewed the evidence and found that other schools with similar policies didn't find any relationship between the searches and violence prevention. They did discover that random searches made for a more hostile learning environment. So searches don't make you safer, but they make it more hostile for the students. They make school an unwelcoming place, which is not what you want when you want someone to learn. So through their activism, the students and their supporters were able to stop the policy from being implemented. So we are at the end of our part 2 of our presentation and the end of our Black History Month presentation. So first, I want to thank everyone so much for sticking through it with us, because it's a lot, and it's a lot of information, and it's also very tough information. And Sindy will talk more about these 3 young women who talk about Somewhere in America.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again. Thank you for Renika for actually doing these 2 parts of this museum. Just a little content information here. We started the museum back in 2018 with Asher Hamilton and a group of volunteers. It was many, many hours. And then we transformed her as a virtual in 2019, so we can do it to the students via COVID era, and that's how we continue after today in 2022. So the following video is 3 amazing young women who are activists in a way different way than other people, but this is why we give voices to youth. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much. And at the end, we will just close the recording, and we hope you enjoy the information. And all we hope also is that you do a little bit of empathy and respect for all this information. Thank you so much.
I'm so proud of my next guests. They're 3 young women who are determined to change the world, one word at a time. They're part of a nonprofit organization called Get Lit, a program here in Los Angeles focused on teaching teens literacy through poetry. They recently opened for John Legend at the Hollywood Bowl, and now they are here to share their powerful performance with us. Please welcome Belissa, Zaria, and Rhiannon.
Here in America, in every single state, they have a set of standards for every subject, a collection of lessons that the teacher is required to teach by the end of the term.
But the greatest lessons you will ever teach us will not come from your syllabus.
The greatest lessons you will ever teach us, you will not even remember. You never told us what we weren't allowed to say. We just learned how to hold our tongues. Now somewhere in America, there's a child holding a copy of Catcher in the Rye, and there's a child holding a gun.
But only one of these things have been banned by their state government, and it's not the one that can rip through flesh.
It's the one that says F you on more pages ways than one, because we must control what the people say, how they think.
And if they want to become the overseer of their own selves,
then we'll show them a real one. And somewhere in America, there's a child sitting at his mother's computer, reading the homepage of the KKK's website. And that's open to the public, but that child will have never read To Kill a Mockingbird because the school has banned it for its use of the N-word.
Maya Angelou is prohibited because we're not allowed to talk about rape in school.
We were taught that just because something happens doesn't mean you are to talk about it.
They build us brand new shopping malls
So that we'll forget where we're really standing, on the bones of the Hispanics, on the bones of the slaves, on the bones of the Native Americans, on the bones of those who fought just to speak.
Transcontinental railroad to Japanese internment camps.
There are things missing from our history books. But we were taught that it is better to be silent than to make them uncomfortable. Somewhere in America,
Private schoolgirls search for hours through boutiques trying to find the prom dress of their dreams.
while kids on the South Side spend hours searching through the lost and found, because winter's coming soon and that's the only jacket they have.
Kids are late to class for working the midnight shift.
They give awards for best attendance, but not for keeping your family off the streets. These kids will call your music ghetto. They will tell you don't talk right.
Then they'll get in the backseat of a car with all their friends,
Sing about how they're about that life and we can't stop. Somewhere in America,
schools are promoting self-confidence
while they whip out their scales and shout out your body fat percentage in class.
where the heftier girls are hiding away. And the slim fit beauties can't help but giggle with pride.
The preppy kids go thrift shopping because they think it sounds fun.
But we go because that's all we've got money for. Because mama works for the city. Mama only gets paid once a month. Somewhere in America,
A girl's getting felt up by a grown man on the subway.
She's still in her school uniform, and that's part of the appeal.
It's hard to run in knee socks and Mary Janes, and all her male teachers know it too. Coaches cover up star players raping freshmen after the dance.
Women are killed for rejecting dates.
But God forbid I bring my girlfriend to prom.
A girl is blackout drunk at the after party.
Take a picture before her wounds wake her.
How many pixels is your sanity worth?
What's a 4.0 to a cold jury?
What'd you learn in class today?
Don't talk loud.
Don't speak loud.
Keep your hands to yourself.
Keep your head down.
Keep your eyes on your own paper. If you don't know the answer,
Fill in C. Always wear earbuds when you ride the bus alone. If you feel like someone's following you, pretend you're on the phone. A teacher never fails, only you do. Every state in America, the greatest lessons are the ones you don't remember learning.
Thank you again and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.